John Horse, forgotten African-American leader of the Second Seminole War. Throughout the annals of American history, much of the role of African Americans has been seriously neglected or misrepresented by historians. The Seminole War was no exception to this rule. While defiant Indians like Osceola and Billy Bowlegs have become well known for their fighting and historically heroic against the mighty of the U.S. Army, other key leaders have been ignored. The neglect of the important resistance leaders have been the greatest regard to those war chiefs who were not Indian but black. Indeed, one of the most forgotten but the most important leaders of the Seminole War were fiery and capable John Horse, who was an African American. John Horse first appeared in the pages of American history as a result of an amusing accident that occurred in Florida and in the Florida Territory during October 19, 1826 at Fort Brooke near the present-day Tampa Bay, Florida. Blue-class soldiers of the 4th Infantry Division met a young man who they never forget, John Horse or Juan Cavella. Spanish lineage was not only indicated by Horse's proper name, but also showed that he had been a slave owned by his part Hispanic and Indian master in Florida. Certainly, it was not the physical appearance of young John that first impressed the West Point educated and blue blood officers of one of the Republic's best infantry unit. Indeed, in 1826, John was a member of the Seminole tribe and 14 years of age. He was gangly, thin, and long-legged and looked somewhat sickly. Hardly could the U.S. officer stationed at Fort Brooke imagine that one day this unpromising African American will be a formidable adversary and highly skilled military leader who cannot be defeated on the battlefield. Despite his appearances and personal characteristics, which most distinguished John Horse at Fort Brooke was his intelligence, savvy, and cunning. During this period, members of the Seminole tribe often sold turkey, venison, and whooping crane, which had been trapped or shot in the forests and swamps, to the United States garrison at Fort Brooke. By this method, members of the garrison implemented their daily routine with war rations with fresh meat. For the U.S. Army soldiers, including many recents from immigrant Europe, a tortoise or a gopher was considered the best tasting natural cuisine on a mess table from Florida wilderness. John Horse knew as much. He subsequently embarked on a vigorous hunt through the pineland along Tampa Bay for turtles and burrowed deep in the sandy soil. John band of Seminoles had visited Fort Brooke during the fall of 1826. Young John and his people were from a picturesque Lake Thursday or Thorasada area just northeast of Tampa Bay. At this time, these African Americans and Seminoles were safely out of harm's way or the path of the relentless white encroachment. One balmy autumn day, the long-legged, lazy Negro boy named John Horse brought 2 of the highly covered turtles to the officer's quarters on Brooks for sale. The sale deal was quickly struck, and John Horse walked away from the transition with a proper $0.25. Here at the quiet Fort Brooks, John had a close look at the institution of slavery in the Alabama world of white Americans when an officer's black cook took the turtles and placed them in a holding area to fatten them up before the slaughter. For the next 10 days, John repeated the process each morning, bringing 2 turtles to the fort, striking the deal, and walking away with money. The business arrangement was the same. Officers netted John Horse a total of $2.50 in a week and a half, which is a fantastic sum in 1826 for a poor young Negro, Seminole in the wilds of untamed Florida. At the end of the 10 days, the officer ordered his slave, named Andrew, to evaluate the condition of the number of turtles in the pen. By his own estimation, the soldiers expected this supply to have swollen to 20 turtles, but to St. Andrews thunder and struck to discover that only 2 reptiles in the pen fence rail had been covered in the bush to screen from the hot sun. Finally, the United States soldier began to suspect that they had become a victim of John's shrewdness. Indeed, he had been reselling the same 2 turtles for the consecutive 10 days. After slipping past the guards into Fort Brooke in the blackness, he had taken the reptiles for 10 consecutive nights to resell them the following day. The enraged officer, perhaps a West Pointer, probably Southern-born, immediately dispatched his orderly outside the fort to apprehend Master John. Finally, the team was found, and John was escorted back to Fort Brooke inside the Army isolation. He was threatened with a whipping like a common slave on a deep South cotton plantation. To avoid such a fate, the spunky John explained his clever rules to an audience with considerable wit. The humor-spliced confession raised as much laughter among the garrison. Indeed, throughout the fort, John's accomplishment resulted in much amusement and a joke that took the pen one another soldier. Immediately intimidated with guilt, the unlooking black youngster had won friends with his personality and winning ways. Therefore, no punishment took place, and John Horse was released to rejoin his freedom-spirited people in the unspoiled country that was still their own. He had earned the nickname Gopher John among the white community and at the garrison of Fort Brooke. As no one could imagine, Gopher John would become a fierce leader of a desperate, hard-fighting band of ex-slave Negro Seminoles who will play a key role in afflicting the proud 4th United States Infantry in its worst beating in the battlefield in only 11 years. Only at age 14, John Horse had proved himself to be a precocious youngster man with unusual talents and ability far beyond his peers. John probably did not disapprove of the nickname Gopher John, which had been bestowed upon by whites. For an African American raised in Seminole culture as John Horse, such a nickname embodied more significant and much more different meaning to him, which cannot be fully understood by white Americans. The Seminole respect and believe in religious light, mystical qualities of the turtle and the gopher. This reptile represents a powerful spirit from the water world and a spirit of magical spirit of special significance in Florida. Indeed, John seemed willingly to have been blessed with the spiritual power force of events that are proved in the bloody Second Seminole War. Historian Kenneth Wiggins Porter, for instance, wrote that this true historical figure in American history, John Stuart Horse, deserved to be more lofty in the place of American consciousness than the celebrated white hero of Tennessee and Texas, Davy Crockett. Indeed, Porter's comparison illuminates some of the interesting parallels and highlights some of the basic contradictions found in American history. On March 6, 1836, for instance, Crockett and other United States and Texas defenders were killed in the last man at the Alamo and perhaps the most dramatic stand in American history. But ironically, in their struggle for their own self-determination, the Texas colonists and United States volunteers were also fighting on behalf of their rights to maintain the institution of slavery. In their view, it was a right brought from the Texas frontier, a province of the Republic of Mexico. The Hispanic attackers upon the Alamo, in contrast, were struggling on behalf of the rights and freedoms of Mexico, which had abolished slavery after the nation had revolted against Spain in 1810. When the Alamo fell in 1836, John Cavilla would be one of those leading the fight against the forced removal and extermination of the Seminole people and the re-enslavement of large number of African Americans, ex-slaves, or descendants of slaves. The historical question as which the cultural hero Davy Crockett or John Horse best represents is a more enlightened example of the defender of liberty and freedom can be easily answered by Americans today. Some of the same personal characteristics was first denounced by John Horse at Fort Brooke, helping earn the title role of the primary Negro Seminole leader during the Second Seminole War by 1837. Now, about the age of 25, he had become the most militant and uncompromising African-American leader of his fellow slaves and Seminole blacks who will find and preserve their way of life and freedom in Florida. During the conflict, Horse had risen swiftly and relentlessly up the leadership hierarchy by his own merit after numerous engagements with white troops. It was barely a year. John Horse was elevated from sub-chief to war chief. This distinction remains one of the few examples of the Seminole people bestowing a war title on an African American, the ultimate compliment. Evidence the vigor of combat and ever-escalating casualties and a desperate need to defeat the invaders at any cost helped the Seminoles lure their own predators and welcome John Horse into the upper command structure. He serves as an ideal military leader for a large body of former slaves who had escaped from or was liberated from the plantations in Georgia and Florida by raiding Seminoles. This hardy band of freedom fighters were Seminole blacks who warriors of both African and Indian ancestry. As their large, two distinct and unique cultures had mingled and become one. These African Americans, now dressed in Seminole costumes, were the primary cause of the Indian Rebellion against the United States government policy of forced Indian removal to the present-day Oklahoma. The United States military was desperate to crush the revolt, fearing slaves in revolt in Florida might ignite a slow rebellion across the South. Hence, the freedom of the Indians and black had to be stripped away for the preservation of the status quo and the safety of white society. These African Americans were struggling against the loss of their Florida lands and the banishment of themselves and their families of a life of slavery. Unlike some of the Seminoles, these enemy warriors were the most resolute fighters, and they were fueled by a desperate motivation and powerful will to resist. They were determined to fight to the bitter end if necessary to avoid re-enslavement by whites. John Horse could not have led a more highly motivated or determined band of warriors than the Indian Negroes and former slaves. During the years of bloody guerrilla war, John Horse taught heroes on the battlefield won him the war name Hakos Hikos, or Crazy Beast, an honorary war title meaning that his heart was recklessly brave. In his prestigious rank and high honor bestowed upon him by the Seminoles, Horse had first proved his leadership abilities in combat as a top lieutenant under the resolute Seminole leader, Alligator. On December 28, 1835, Horse had been among the guerrilla fighters as well to conceive ambush. On that cool winter morning, the concealed Indians and ex-slaves had wiped out Major Francis Langhorn Dade, 105-man command of the Fort Brooke in a massacre that shocked the entire country. This victory sparked the Second Seminole War. In addition, John Horse proved to be recklessly brave at the battles of Winnetonka Crossing in December of 1835 and the Wahoo Swamp in November 1836. The same aggressive style of leadership was also demonstrated by him in numerous skirmishes and raids. By late 1837, John had become a formidable and capable African-American military leader of the Seminole Nation. The young commander's fame was destined to spread until he became the most respected and legendary black warrior in Seminole history. By this period, not only was John Horse's deeds in combat becoming legendary, but also a striking physique separating him from his fellow warriors. Imposing physical characteristics strengthened his command presence and ability to lead former slaves and Seminole Negroes in battle. Indeed, the handsome warrior leader named Horse was described during the war as a tall, slim man, big, stout, proud. He walked proud. Despite typical prejudice of the day, even the white soldiers were impressed by Horse. One United States officer, for example, having known him at Fort Brooke in 1826, had now discovered that Gopher John had grown up from a long-legged, ill-looking Negro boy to a fine-looking fellow of 6 feet and as straight as an Indian, with a smile of a red blood mailing from his forehead. His dress was remarkably well, and altogether jaunty air that would fix your attention upon him at sight. Historian Kenneth Porter discovered how that well into the 20th century, the long-suffering black and independent people of John Horse's band having been transplanted from Texas to Florida, recall him as a tall, perfect, and erect, powerful form, proud step, handsome features, black skin with a coppery glow behind, and long, crinkly hair, always carefully combed, combined in the Indian garb of the Seminole Nation. Indeed, John Horse had come a long way since the days of selling turtles to United States soldiers at Fort Brooke. From having been born to a slave of Charles Cavallo, an Indian of Spanish ancestry, he had become an expert in guerrilla warfare in the Florida wilderness. John's mom had been a slave and perhaps a native of West Africa. Evidently, John Horse was a result of a union between her and the master, Charles Cavallo. John had been raised on the fertile and picturesque Okeechobee in north central Florida. When the Second Seminole War had erupted in 1835, his life was changed forever. He had been a member of the Pease Creek Seminole Band, nestled in the National Reserve. Pease Creek branched off on the Menaring-Kissimmee River in south central Florida to flow southwest into the Gulf of Mexico at Charlotte Harbor. In 1835, this region of Florida was unspoiled and a beautiful country, yet unexploited by the Anglo-Saxon civilization. For a man like John Horse, this is certainly a land worth dying for. John Horse demonstrated his Indian and Spanish heritage, and not only in his language, but also in his dress. One United States officer described him as a tall person, gladly decked in rig bands and silver work, long dark hair laid straight around his shoulders, and ginger colored skin, reflecting his spicy mixture of Spanish, African, and Indian ancestry. Indeed, he was a unique individual based on ancestry alone. Negro, Caucasian, and Indian intermingle into the international flavor of this new type person of the New World, exemplifying both Seminole and Hispanic culture and the heritage. John often wore a cloth around his head and folded in 2-3 big feathers around it. He could speak Seminole, Spanish, and the black dialect of the former plantation slaves who had now commanded their crusade against their white oppressors. John Horse is simply more than an inspirational leader who always took full courage on the battlefield against his people enemies. His role of war chief mean that he had to him simply the method of winning prestigious honor on a battlefield where black and white red men meet in combat. Horse's success in military games against the United States' best forces was the most effective guarantee that his people, black and red, will remain free in the land of their birth and that of their ancestors. Unlike some war chief who was always looking after his people while in battle or being pursued by military forces. Also, Horse mastered the prestigious art of being a tribal doctor or medicine man. He had the same herbal healing medicines of the remedies of the Seminoles and honorable respect of some tribe. Some of those explorers may originate in Mother Africa. Some, both on the fields of medicine and war, John Horse excelled and gained more respect as a leader. In addition, horse marksmanship with a loading muzzle rifle had likewise become legendary through the tribe in this bitter war of extermination. During the arduous years of the active campaign against impossible odds, he attracted many followers after the skilled combination and attribute to the military, spiritual, with medicine, and tribal leader of his persecuted people. By the fateful year of 1837, John Horse had much to be reason to be bitter. The conflict had turned against his people in the enemy's favor. In the fall of 1837, Major General Thomas S. Jesup had ordered the capture of the Seminole and African American men and women and children during a truce to eliminate the support of the base of the resistance movement. Additionally, United States military leaders developed a strategy of taking the war to isolated villages of the Indians and African Americans deep inside the Florida wilds. In a war that was becoming total, it was increasingly imperative United States troops to strike deep terror in the interior. This meant burning Seminole and black villages, food supplies, and crops in the fields to deprive the guerrillas of their logistical support. Not only the warriors, but their families and the homes of the African Americans and their Indian allies were targeted in a brutal policy of destroying their homeland in the 20th century like war. One of the truce violations, John Horse and Wildcat, or Cocochachi, and other resistance leaders were captured and thrown into prison. Wildcat, another fierce young warrior who thought much like John Horse, to save the land they loved and the people from annihilation, it was necessary to defeat the invaders and fight forever if necessary. John Horse and Wildcat would become an effective leadership team in their fierce guerrillas battle against the United States. Not a better example can be found during the Second Seminole War of an Indian leader and an African American leader working together in tandem, forging an effective military team against the whites. Both John Horse and Wildcats, along with others, endured the agony of confinement in a squalor of prison in Fort Marion at St. Augustine, Florida. But after a short confinement, these two invaluable leaders of the resistance movement escaped in late November 1837. The effort among the demoralized Seminole blacks and ex-slaves and Indians were revitalized with the escape of Horse, Wildcats, and others, and once they rejoined their persecuted people, this escape rekindled the will to resist and inspired hope and belief that God was yet on their side. After John Horse and Wildcat rejoined their people and combined their forces for the largest pro-resistance force of red and black people now remaining in Florida, drifted south. For weeks, the fights continued deeper into the primeval Florida territory. When it appeared that the United States had practically won the war, the rejoining of Horse and Wildcats with their people meant that a more militant and more determined leadership was once more in the field, ensuring that conflict would continue as fiercely as ever before. More than the horrors of imprisonment, John Horse was infuriated because of his people were not only being killed, but those who surrendered were fated to receive brutal treatment. The peoples of Horse Band and others, both black and red, were shipped west to ever-increasing numbers. Numbers would die during the forced march to what would become known as Indian Territory. As United States soldiers destroyed more villages and cropland, while the wives, the parents, the children, and the grandparents of the Indian and African American warriors were driven to capitulations by hunger, disease, nakedness, and overwhelming odds. Much of Horse's original homeland had been overran by the Blue Coat legions, and the rich land of the Opportunity Prairie had quickly fallen to be overwhelmed by the conquerors. John Horse would never again hunt, fish, and roam this Eden of the South as in his early days. Here in Achalucha in the northern central Florida, the original Seminoles had their first taken roots in Florida territory after separating from the Creek tribe in Georgia around 1750. But the white settlers had long coveted this further region known as Achalucha, a primary reason which was cause of the Second Seminole War. Consequently, driving the Indians, black, and the Seminole Negroes from the land of their birth and forcibly moved them west for the benefit of white settlers. John Horse and his followers understood that to be allowed to live in peace, they must defeat any large force sent against them. That opportunity would come Christmas Day of 1837 against a sizable United States force that pursued them south into the vast wilderness. After escaping from the hill and from Fort Marion, John Horse, Wildcat, and their bands had linked up with active bands of the Muscogee Indians, the most militant Seminoles under Alpaca or Samuel Jones. This absolute force of Indians and blacks now remained in Florida fell back steadily into uncharted interior until taking a stand in the northeastern shore of Lake Okeechobee. Here they made their most tenacious defense against the invaders of their homeland. The rapid withdrawal and assault brought them made extensive preparations for battle. For his greatest battle, John Horse commanded a sizable number of former slaves and Seminole blacks amongst the mostly Indian force at Lake Okeechobee. And this bold stand was made in a dense hammock, a narrow forested island of firm ground amidst a sea level of water and sawgrass bordering the Great Lake. The defenders not only had to defeat the approaching invaders, but also had to protect their women and children. A large army now under Colonel Zachary pushed south into the bright sunshine of December, following their prey and pushing close to Lake Okeechobee. As the red and black warriors waited in intense silence amidst the jungle hammocks, their wives and children hid by the nearest thickets beside the lakes. These oppressed people understood the reality of their vicious and often no-quarter war in a harsh land, knowing that their fate now rested upon the fighting ability of their fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands. Already, by the autumn of 1837, these bands had dwindled down to a pitiful few. Many had given up. One non-combatant had recently surrendered was John Horse's sister and her children. As so many others, they had destined to be deported from Florida and marched out to a distant west doing a program that almost resembled genocide. The agony suffered by Jenna Cavallo and the wife of the Indian and her children are now in custody of U.S. forces, only fortified the deeper resolve of John Horse. Around 380 defenders, black-red, took excellent positions in their hammock bordering the Lake Okeechobee. Taylor's large force shortly arrived and destroyed this last stand of defenders in the hammock. More than 1,000 white soldiers deployed in the December sunshine with flags waving in the light of their glittering rows of bayonets. Among Taylor's contingent, ironically, stood the soldiers of the 4th United States Infantry Division. This fine unit included men and officers whom John Horse had known as a boy at Fort Brooke in 1826. Finally, the opportunity for Colonel Taylor and his long dream, forcing the elusive Seminoles, ex-slaves, and Negro Indians to make a stand against the large United States force. The defenders were more than ready on this sunshine Christmas day north of the Everglades. Notches had been cut in the tree to steady rifle fire, and as much as the sawgrass had been hacked down before the hammock for clear fields of fire. Seldom in the annals of military history had Native Americans and African Americans prepared such a brilliant and well-conceived defense. No doubt that John Horse played a major role in formulating such a sound strategy. The blaring bugles launched the attack. Hundreds of Missouri militiamen and U.S. Army soldiers charged forward through the swamp of the sawgrass before the timbered hammock. John Horse and his warriors opened a blistering fire with the Indian brothers when the whites almost reached the hammock. For hours, the red and black warriors shot down attackers, including the colonel of the Missouri Volunteers, Richard Gentry. But eventually, superior numbers carried the day. Consequently, the defenders were forced to flee from the hammock and down the beach of Lake Okeechobee or escape by canoe. Even though they had lost the battle, they escaped to fight another day. The Battle of Lake Okeechobee on this Yuletide in 1837 was the bloodiest contest of the Seminole Wars. Indeed, Colonel Taylor's forces had taken some of the highest losses of any American command. Almost 150 Missouri militiamen and regular Army U.S. troops had been shot down in desperate attempts to capture the hammock. During the one savage contest, one of John Horse's black soldiers was found dead in the hammock by Taylor's men. No doubt other African Americans had been killed or seriously wounded. Retrieving their bodies had become a sacred duty for Horse and his men, and hence the absence of more dead being discovered. The losses were higher on those for the Indians than in the blacks, but these were only a fraction compared to the heavy losses inflicted upon the attackers. Lake Okeechobee had become one of the most costly victories in all American armies during the Indian Wars. December 25th, 1837 had been John Horse's finest day as a commander in battle. Few but better examples of the high level of defiance and ferocity delivered by the ex-slaves on the race that enslaved them can be found. Not long after the gunfire had ceased echoing across Lake Okeechobee, the Indians and African Americans resumed their flight to safety on a long stroke against the invaders. The defenders of the hammock along Lake Okeechobee had been destroyed by Taylor forces, and the tenacious stand made along the lake's northeastern shore guaranteed that the longest and most bitter Indian war in U.S. history would continue until 1842. After the Battle of Lake Okeechobee, John Horse and his followers fled south with the Seminoles towards a last safe hideaway in Florida, the Watery Jungle known as the Everglades. Here they found sanctuary, but an increasing number of U.S. troops maintained heavy pressure. Shortly, the Blue Corps scoured the Everglades in pursuit of their quarry, and life on the run resulted in starvation and the surrender of many black and red soldiers' dependents. And the development of this term will cause many fighters to give up the world as well. Worried about survival of his own wife and children and the further resistance collapsed around him, John Horse surrendered during the spring of 1838. In his valiant fighting for freedom, he had fought against white invaders for more than 2 years during the most brutal guerrilla campaign war ever waged in Americans in the history to that date. By the summer of 1838, John Horse and his people were transported to the United States to the Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. So that's what happened to John Horse, a man, a forgotten hero, you know what I'm saying, who fought for their own land, their own way of rights, and their own self-determination. You know, the militant abolitionists. This book you see right here, The Exile of Florida, is by Josh Glenn. This is a good book to read about it, to get a more of an understanding about what was going on during that time frame. You can also get this from the Library of Congress. This book is right here can put so many Aboriginal cast to shame because these are black people fighting for their rights. Aboriginal, you know what I'm saying, black people fighting for their rights. As maroon people, as Africans in the United States. Anyway, subscribe to the channel. Much love to this ancestor, John Horse, a forgotten hero. Peace, and y'all have a wonderful day.